The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth as Sarah McKenna gripped the wooden bucket handles until her knuckles turned white. The weight of responsibility pressed heavier on her shoulders than the two empty buckets she carried. Behind her, their small cabin stood like a lone sentinel against the vast prairie, smoke no longer rising from the chimney. Inside, her mother Margaret lay on a bed of fever dreams, her lips cracked and desperate for the precious water that seemed always just out of reach. Sarah had made this journey 17 times in the past 3 weeks. 17 terrifying walks through territory that belonged more to the Comanche than to any white settler. The spring that bubbled up from the limestone rocks 3 miles northeast was the only reliable water source for 20 miles in any direction. Their well had run dry 2 months ago, victim of the worst drought anyone could remember. The girl's bare feet knew every stone, every depression in the hard-packed earth. She had memorized the route not just by sight, but by necessity. When you walked the same dangerous path twice a day, your life depended on knowing where to step, where to hide, where to run if the need arose. Today felt different, though. The air itself seemed to whisper warnings. Sarah paused at the edge of what the locals called Dead Horse Draw, a shallow ravine that provided some cover for the first mile of her journey. She listened carefully, her father's teachings echoing in her memory. "Trust your instincts, little one," he had told her before the cholera took him 6 months ago. "The land speaks to those who know how to listen." The wind carried no unusual sounds today. No war cries, no thunder of unshod hooves. Just the endless whisper of grass bending before the hot breeze, and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Sarah took a deep breath and started down into the draw, her worn dress catching briefly on the thorny mesquite that lined the path. The drought had changed everything about their world. 3 years ago, when Sarah was 14, their small homestead had been part of a growing community. The Jenkins family lived 2 miles south, the Weatherbys to the east. Children played together while mothers shared recipes and fathers helped each other with harvests. The creek that ran past their door had been clear and cold, perfect for washing clothes and watering the vegetable garden that provided most of their food. But the rain stopped coming. First one season, then another. The creek became a trickle, then dried up completely. One by one, families packed their wagons and headed back east, back to places where water fell regularly from the sky, and the earth gave up its moisture willingly. The Jenkins left first, then the Weatherbys. Soon, Sarah and her parents were alone in a landscape that grew more hostile with each passing day. The Comanche had noticed the exodus too. With fewer armed men to defend the scattered homesteads, raiding parties grew bolder. They struck at dawn and dusk, taking horses, cattle, and sometimes people. The territorial authorities in Austin were too far away and too overwhelmed to provide real protection. Families that stayed did so at their own risk. Sarah's father had been determined to hold on. "This land will come back," he insisted, even as their neighbors loaded wagons. "The rains will return, and we'll be here when they do." He spent his last months digging deeper wells, hauling water from increasingly distant sources, and teaching Sarah everything he knew about survival in a hostile land. Now Margaret McKenna was all Sarah had left, and Margaret was dying. The fever had started 3 weeks ago, brought on by exhaustion and the constant worry that came with trying to survive in an isolated homestead. At first, Sarah thought it was just the heat affecting her mother. But when Margaret could no longer keep food down and began talking to people who were not there, Sarah knew it was something more serious. Without a doctor within 50 miles and no neighbors to call upon, Sarah did what she could. She made cool compresses from their precious water supply. She tried to force spoonfuls of broth between her mother's cracked lips. Most importantly, she kept making the dangerous journey to the spring, because without water, there was no hope at all. The walk took her past landmarks that had become as familiar as the rooms of their cabin. There was the lightning-split oak where she sometimes rested on the return journey when the full buckets made her arms ache. There was the cluster of red rocks that marked the halfway point. And There was the ridge where Apache warriors had been spotted just 2 weeks ago, though they had moved on without investigating the small cabin below. Sarah had developed a routine for these trips that helped calm her nerves. She would pray as she walked, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently. She would plan what she would do when her mother recovered, because she refused to consider any other possibility. She would remember her father's stories about his own childhood in Kentucky, where water was so plentiful that people took it for granted. Today, as she crested the small hill that led down to the spring, Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief. The water was still flowing, still clear. The pool that collected below the limestone outcropping was perhaps 6 inches lower than it had been a week ago, but there was enough for her needs. She knelt beside the water and filled the first bucket, watching as the precious liquid disappeared into the wooden container that had become the most important object in her world. The ritual of filling the buckets had become almost meditative. She would fill one bucket completely, then the second. She would drink her fill while she was here, knowing that every drop saved at home was a drop her mother might need. She would splash water on her face and arms, washing away the sweat and dust of the journey. And then she would begin the careful walk home, moving slowly to avoid spilling even a drop of the life-sustaining liquid. But today, as Sarah lifted the second bucket from the pool, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps. Human footsteps, soft but unmistakable, coming from the direction she had just traveled. Her father had taught her what to do in this situation. Move quickly, but do not run unless absolutely necessary. Running spilled water and made noise. Find cover and assess the threat. Do not assume the worst, but prepare for it. Sarah crouched behind the limestone rocks that surrounded the spring, her heart hammering against her ribs. She set the buckets down as quietly as she could and peered carefully around the edge of the stone. What she saw made her stomach clench with fear. A Comanche warrior stood at the top of the small rise, perhaps 50 yards away. He was young, maybe only a few years older than Sarah herself. His long black hair was decorated with feathers, and he carried a bow with a quiver of arrows across his back. But what terrified Sarah most was how still he was. He was not moving, not searching. He was simply standing there, looking directly at the spring where she was hiding. Sarah's mind raced through her limited options. She could try to hide until he left, but that might take hours, and her mother needed the water now. She could try to circle around him and reach home by a different route, but she did not know the land well enough to be certain of finding her way. She could simply wait and hope he meant no harm, but everything she had been taught about the Comanche suggested that was a dangerous gamble. The warrior began to move down the hill toward the spring, and Sarah felt panic rising in her throat. She gripped her father's hunting knife, the one tool she carried for protection, though she knew it would be little use against a trained fighter. Her hands shook as she tried to remember everything her father had taught her about dealing with hostile encounters. "Do not show fear," he had said. "Fear makes you pray. Stand tall, keep your voice steady, and remember that most people, even enemies, would rather avoid a fight if they can." The footsteps grew closer. Sarah could hear each soft impact of moccasined feet on the hard ground. She closed her eyes and said a silent prayer, then stood up from behind the rocks, her knife held low but visible. The Comanche warrior stopped when he saw her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small clearing around the spring. Sarah was surprised by how young he appeared up close. His face was painted with red and yellow stripes, but beneath the war paint, she could see features that spoke of intelligence rather than mindless aggression. "I mean no harm," Sarah said in English, though she doubted he understood the words. She gestured toward the buckets, then toward herself, trying to communicate through actions what she could not say in his language. "Water. For my mother. She is sick." The warrior tilted his head slightly, studying her with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything about her situation. He looked at the buckets, at her simple dress and worn shoes, at the knife she held with hands that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. Then he did something that surprised Sarah completely. He stepped aside and gestured toward the spring. Sarah stared at him, uncertain whether this was some kind of trick or trap. But the warrior made no threatening moves. He simply stood to one side of the path, his bow remaining on his back, his hands empty. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah moved toward the buckets she had abandoned. The Comanche watched as she picked up the containers and checked to ensure they were still full. When she straightened, he was looking directly at her face, and Sarah realized he was trying to communicate something. He pointed to himself, then to her, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate the path back toward her homestead. Was he offering to escort her? Sarah could not understand why a Comanche warrior would want to help a white settler, but she could think of no other explanation for his behavior. Her father had told her stories about individual Indians who had helped white families, though such instances were rare and usually involved some kind of prior relationship or debt. Sarah nodded slowly, indicating that she understood his offer, even if she did not understand his motivations. The warrior turned and began walking up the hill, moving at a pace that would allow her to keep up while carrying the heavy buckets. The journey back to the homestead was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The Comanche warrior walked about 20 yards ahead of her, moving with a fluid grace that made no unnecessary noise. He seemed to be constantly aware of his surroundings, his head turning to check sight lines and potential threats that Sarah would never have noticed. Several times during the walk, he held up a hand to signal her to stop. Each time, Sarah froze and waited while he listened to sounds she could not hear. After a few moments, he would motion for her to continue, and they would resume their strange procession across the dangerous landscape. Sarah found herself studying the warrior as they walked. His clothing was functional rather than decorative, designed for movement and survival rather than ceremony. His weapons were well maintained but showed signs of use. This was not a young man playing at being a warrior. This was someone who lived by his skills and understood the deadly serious nature of frontier life. As they approached the ridge that overlooked Sarah's homestead, the warrior stopped and crouched low. He motioned for Sarah to do the same, then pointed toward the cabin below. Sarah followed his gaze and saw what had caught his attention. Smoke was rising from their chimney, but she had not lit a fire that morning. Someone was in their cabin. The warrior turned to look at Sarah, and she saw genuine concern in his eyes. He pointed to her, then to a cluster of rocks that would provide good cover, then held up his hand to indicate she should wait. Sarah understood. He was going to investigate the cabin alone. But Sarah shook her head firmly. That was her home, her mother. Whatever was happening down there, she could not simply hide and wait while someone else determined her fate. She pointed to herself, then to the cabin, trying to communicate that she needed to go down there regardless of the danger. The warrior studied her for a long moment, then nodded with what might have been respect. He held up 2 fingers, pointed to her eyes, then to his own. Stay alert. Watch for signals. Sarah nodded her understanding. Together, they began the careful descent toward the cabin where Sarah's mother lay helpless and unknown visitors had made themselves at home. The approach to the cabin required every skill Sarah had learned about moving quietly through hostile territory. The Comanche warrior, whom she had begun thinking of as her unlikely guardian, demonstrated a level of stealth that bordered on the supernatural. He seemed to flow across the landscape like water, never disturbing so much as a loose stone or dry branch. Sarah tried to match his movements, though she knew she was clumsy by comparison. The wooden buckets, still nearly full of precious water, made her task more difficult. Every few steps, she had to pause and adjust her grip to prevent the containers from banging against her legs or each other. As they drew closer to the homestead, Sarah could make out more details that filled her with dread. 2 horses were tied to the hitching post her father had built beside the cabin. Neither animal belonged to any neighbor she recognized. The horses were well fed and bore saddles that looked expensive, suggesting their owners were not simple travelers in need of shelter. The smoke rising from the chimney was thick and black, indicating that whoever was inside had built up the fire considerably. Sarah knew her mother was too weak to leave her bed, much less tend to a fire. The strangers had made themselves completely at home in her family sanctuary. The warrior held up his hand again, bringing their advance to a halt about 50 yards from the cabin. He pointed to his ear, then toward the building. Sarah strained to listen and caught the sound of voices drifting through the open windows. Male voices, at least two of them, speaking in English with accents she recognized as Texan. "Check the bedroom again," one voice said. "Woman like that might have valuables hidden somewhere." "Already did," came the reply. "Nothing but some old letters and a Bible. This family's poor as dirt." Sarah's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her mother, searching through their belongings like common thieves. But something about their casual tone suggested they were more dangerous than simple robbers. These men were comfortable with what they were doing, experienced in the business of taking what did not belong to them. The warrior beside her seemed to understand the situation without needing to speak English. His hand moved slowly to the knife at his belt, and Sarah could see the muscles in his shoulders tense. Whatever these men were doing, he clearly did not approve. "What about the girl?" the first voice asked. "Tracks show she left this morning. She'll be back." "We'll wait," the second man replied. "Boss wants to know about any families still holding out in this area. Girl that age could be useful." Sarah felt her stomach turn at the implication. These were not random bandits. They were part of some larger operation, scouting for isolated families that could be robbed, kidnapped, or worse. Her mother's illness had saved them from immediate discovery, but only temporarily. The warrior touched Sarah's arm gently and gestured toward a depression in the ground about 20 yards to their left. It would provide better cover while they decided what to do next. Sarah nodded and followed him, moving as quietly as she could manage while carrying the water buckets. Once they were hidden in the small gully, the warrior turned to study Sarah's face. She could see him thinking, weighing options, trying to communicate something important without words. Finally, he held up two fingers, pointed toward the cabin, then made a slashing motion across his throat. "Two men. Dangerous." Sarah understood. She also understood that without help, she had no chance of rescuing her mother or driving off the intruders. The warrior seemed to recognize this as well. He pointed to himself, then made a circling motion with his finger, indicating he would go around to the back of the cabin. Then he pointed to Sarah and gestured for her to wait. But Sarah shook her head. She could not simply hide while her mother remained at the mercy of these men. She set down the water buckets and pulled out her father's knife, showing the warrior that she was prepared to fight if necessary. The warrior looked at her for a long moment, then nodded with what might have been admiration. He held up his hand to indicate they should wait a few more minutes, then pointed toward the sun. Sarah realized he was timing their approach to coincide with a moment when the afternoon light would be at their backs, making them harder to see from inside the cabin. As they waited, Sarah found herself studying her unlikely ally more closely. His face, beneath the war paint, was younger than she had first thought. Perhaps 19 or 20. Old enough to be a seasoned warrior, but young enough that his presence here, helping a white settler, suggested something unusual about his character or circumstances. Why was he helping her? Sarah had heard stories of Indians who had been raised by white families, or who had personal reasons for opposing raiding parties. But she had never heard of a Comanche warrior spontaneously deciding to aid a stranger in need. The more she thought about it, the more mysterious his behavior became. The warrior raised his hand, indicating it was time to move. He pointed again toward the back of the cabin, then gestured for Sarah to approach from the front. The plan seemed to be a coordinated assault that would give the intruders no chance to harm her mother or escape with whatever they had stolen. Sarah picked up her water buckets, thinking they might provide both camouflage and weapons if needed. The familiar weight of the containers was oddly comforting. She had carried these buckets so many times that they felt like extensions of her own arms. Moving carefully, Sarah made her way toward the front of the cabin while the warrior disappeared into the scrub brush behind the building. She could hear the men inside talking, their voices relaxed and confident. They clearly did not expect any trouble from a teenage girl returning with water. As Sarah reached the edge of the clearing around the cabin, She heard her mother's voice for the first time in hours. Margaret was speaking, though her words were unclear from this distance. The sound filled Sarah with both relief and urgent worry. Her mother was alive, but she sounded weak and confused. "Shut up, old woman," one of the men said harshly. "Nobody asked you to talk." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. These men were not just thieves. They were the kind of brutal predators who preyed on the weak and helpless. Her father had warned her about such people, explaining that the frontier attracted not just honest settlers seeking new opportunities, but also criminals fleeing justice in more civilized places. Sarah reached the front of the cabin and paused beside the door. Through the window, she could see one of the men sitting at their kitchen table, eating food from their meager supplies. He was a large man with dirty brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. A gun belt hung on the chair beside him, suggesting he was confident enough to set aside his weapons while he ate. The other man was not visible from her position, but Sarah could hear him moving around in the back room where her mother lay. The sounds of drawers being opened and belongings scattered filled her with rage. These men were destroying the few possessions her family had managed to accumulate over years of hard work. Sarah looked toward the back of the cabin, hoping to catch some sign of the warrior's position. She saw nothing, but somehow she sensed he was in place and ready. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the knife in her right hand and pushed open the cabin door with her left. The man at the table looked up in surprise as Sarah entered. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as if trying to process the appearance of a teenage girl carrying water buckets and looking anything but intimidated. Well, he said finally, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Look what we have here. You must be the little lady of the house." Sarah said nothing. She set down the water buckets carefully and tried to assess the situation. The man's gun was within his reach, but not in his hand. The second man was still in the bedroom with her mother. If the warrior was ready to act, this might be their only chance to gain the advantage. "Cat got your tongue?" the man asked, starting to rise from his chair. "That's all right. We got plenty of time to get acquainted." The man's hand moved toward his gun belt, and Sarah knew she had to act. She lunged forward, her father's knife aimed at the intruder's chest. But the man was faster than she had anticipated. He caught her wrist and twisted, causing her to drop the weapon. "Now, that's not very friendly," he said, his grip tightening painfully on her arm. "Jim, get out here. Our little bird has come home." The second man appeared in the doorway to the bedroom, and Sarah felt her heart sink. He was even larger than his partner, with scars on his face that spoke of a lifetime of violence. In his hand, he carried a small bag that undoubtedly contained whatever valuables he had managed to find. "Pretty little thing," Jim observed, looking Sarah up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Boss will be pleased with this one." "My thoughts exactly," the first man agreed. He was about to say something else when a shadow appeared at the back window of the cabin. The warrior moved with deadly precision. The rear window of the cabin had no glass, only wooden shutters that were currently open to let in air. He came through the opening like a force of nature, his knife already drawn and ready. Jim had no time to react. The warrior's blade found its mark between the intruder's ribs, and the big man fell forward without even crying out. His partner released Sarah and reached for his gun, but the warrior was already moving across the small room. The fight that followed was brief, but intense. The surviving intruder managed to draw his weapon, but the confines of the cabin worked against him. The warrior ducked under the man's first shot and closed the distance before a second shot could be fired. Sarah watched in amazement as her Comanche ally demonstrated the fighting skills that made his people legendary. Every movement was precise, economical, deadly. Within moments, both intruders lay still on the cabin floor, and the immediate threat was over. The warrior stood, breathing heavily, his knife still in his hand, looking around the cabin to ensure there were no other threats. When he was satisfied they were safe, he turned to Sarah and gestured toward the bedroom where her mother lay. Sarah rushed to her mother's bedside and found Margaret conscious but clearly distressed by the commotion. The older woman's eyes widened when she saw the warrior following her daughter into the room. "Sarah," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who is this man? What has happened?" "It's all right, Mama," Sarah said, kneeling beside the bed and taking her mother's hand. "These men were here to hurt us. He helped me stop them." Margaret looked from her daughter to the Comanche warrior, confusion evident in her fever-bright eyes. The man stood respectfully near the doorway, his weapons now put away, his painted face somehow less threatening in the dim light of the sick room. "Water," Margaret said simply. "I need water." Sarah realized she had left the buckets in the front room. She looked toward the warrior, who seemed to understand immediately. He gestured for her to stay with her mother while he retrieved the precious containers. When the warrior returned with the water, Sarah helped her mother drink slowly and carefully. The liquid seemed to revive Margaret slightly, and her eyes became more focused and alert. "Thank you," Margaret said, looking directly at the warrior. "Thank you for helping my daughter." The warrior nodded solemnly, though Sarah doubted he understood the specific words. The meaning, however, was clear from Margaret's tone and expression. As evening approached, Sarah realized she faced a new set of challenges. The two dead men outside would attract scavengers if left unburied. Their horses needed to be dealt with. Most importantly, she needed to determine whether more men from their group might come looking for them. The warrior seemed to understand these concerns as well. He gestured toward the front room, indicating they should discuss what to do next. Sarah helped her mother take another drink of water, then followed him back to where the bodies lay. Through a combination of gestures and simple drawings in the dirt floor, the warrior communicated that he believed these men were scouts for a larger group. He held up many fingers, suggesting a significant number of dangerous people might be involved. Then he pointed toward the horizon and made a sweeping motion, indicating they might need to move to avoid detection. Sarah shook her head firmly. Her mother was too sick to travel, and they had nowhere else to go. The warrior studied her determined expression, then nodded with what might have been respect. He pointed to himself, then to the area around the cabin, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate he would stay and help defend the homestead. As darkness fell over the Texas landscape, Sarah found herself in a situation she could never have imagined. Her dying mother lay in the bedroom, dependent on water that required dangerous daily trips to obtain. Two dead bandits lay in her front room, evidence of violence that would certainly bring retaliation if discovered. And somewhere in the night, a Comanche warrior she did not know and could not communicate with had appointed himself their protector. The next few days would test everything Sarah had learned about survival, courage, and the unexpected alliances that could form when people faced desperate circumstances together. The disposal of two dead men in the middle of hostile territory presented challenges Sarah had never imagined facing. The Comanche warrior, who had taken to watching the horizon with the intensity of a hunting hawk, made it clear through gestures that the bodies could not remain in the cabin. The smell would attract both animal and human scavengers, and the evidence of violence would bring unwanted questions from anyone who might pass by. Working together in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah and her unlikely protector dragged the bodies outside. The warrior had indicated they should be buried in a location that would not be easily discovered, but far enough from the homestead to avoid contaminating their water sources. The irony was not lost on Sarah that they were protecting the same water she had risked her life to obtain just yesterday. The warrior proved to be practical as well as deadly. He examined the clothing and weapons of the dead men with the thoroughness of someone who understood that such items could provide valuable intelligence. At least a dozen other homesteads were similarly marked, scattered across an area that encompassed hundreds of square miles. The warrior pointed to the map, then held up many fingers again. His meaning was clear. This was not the work of a small gang of opportunistic thieves. This was an organized effort involving many men and covering a vast territory. Sarah and her mother had stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than simple banditry. As the sun rose over the Texas plains, Sarah made her morning journey to check on her mother. Margaret appeared slightly stronger today, perhaps benefiting from the steady supply of water and the knowledge that the immediate threat had been dealt with. But she was still far from well, and Sarah knew that any significant stress or exertion could prove fatal. "The Indian boy," Margaret said when Sarah brought her fresh water and a small portion of broth. "He is still here?" Sarah nodded, unsure how to explain the complex situation they found themselves in. "He helped us, Mama. Those men would have hurt us badly if he had not been here." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, sipping slowly from the cup Sarah held to her lips. "Your father used to tell stories about Indians who were different from the raiders. Men who lived by codes of honor that white folks did not always understand." "What do you mean?" "Some tribes believe that if you save someone's life, you become responsible for protecting them," Margaret explained. "It creates a bond that goes beyond ordinary friendship or alliance." Sarah pondered this as she helped her mother eat. Could that explain why the warrior had stayed? Had his decision to help her at the spring created some kind of obligation that he felt bound to fulfill? When Sarah returned to the main room, she found the warrior studying the horses that had belonged to the dead men. The animals were valuable, well-trained mounts that could be sold or traded for significant amounts of money or supplies. But keeping them also posed risks. If other members of the gang came looking for their missing scouts, recognizable horses would be damning evidence. The warrior seemed to reach the same conclusion. He gestured toward the animals, then made a shooing motion with his hands. The horses needed to disappear, but not in a way that would suggest they had been stolen. After some consideration, he removed their saddles and bridles, then led them several miles away before releasing them. Wild horses were common enough in this region that their appearance would not necessarily arouse suspicion. The saddles and tack, however, he brought back to the cabin. Such items could be useful for trade, and they bore no distinctive markings that would identify their previous owners. Sarah watched him cache the leather goods in a hiding place beneath loose floorboards, impressed by his practical approach to what could have been an overwhelming situation. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself learning to communicate with her protector through a combination of gestures, expressions, and simple drawings. She discovered that he had a name that sounded something like Ayana, though she was uncertain of the exact pronunciation. More importantly, she learned that he possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the landscape for signs of danger. Twice during the afternoon, Ayana held up his hand and pointed toward the horizon. Each time, Sarah saw nothing unusual. But within minutes, riders would appear in the distance, following trails that would bring them within sight of the homestead. Each time, the riders passed by without investigating the cabin, but Sarah realized that without Ayana's warning, she would have been caught completely unprepared. "How does he know?" she asked her mother during one of her afternoon visits to the sickroom. "Indians read the land the way we read books," Margaret replied. "They notice things we miss. Changes in the way birds fly, tracks in the dust, the way horses move when they carry nervous riders." That evening, as Sarah prepared a simple meal from their dwindling supplies, Ayana approached her with obvious concern. He pointed to the food stores, then held up a few fingers, clearly indicating that they had provisions for only a few more days. The dead men had consumed some of their supplies, but the larger problem was that Sarah had been so focused on obtaining water for her mother that she had neglected to hunt or gather other necessities. Ayana gestured toward himself, then toward the darkening landscape beyond the cabin. He was offering to hunt, to provide food for the small group that had formed around the struggle to keep Margaret alive. Sarah nodded gratefully, realizing that her family's survival now depended entirely on the kindness of a man she had met only yesterday. While Ayana was gone, Sarah sat beside her mother's bed and tried to process everything that had happened. 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been making the dangerous journey to the spring twice each day. Now she was hiding evidence of violent deaths, depending on a Comanche warrior for protection, and facing the possibility that organized criminals were targeting isolated families throughout the region. "Are you frightened?" Margaret asked, as if reading her daughter's thoughts. Terrified, Sarah admitted, but also grateful. If Ayana had not been at the spring yesterday, those men would have taken me. You would have died alone. And now? Sarah considered the question seriously. Now we have a chance. He is teaching me things about staying safe that Papa never knew. And he seems determined to protect us, though I do not understand why. Margaret smiled weakly. Perhaps understanding is not as important as accepting. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places, and the wise person does not question the gift. Ayana returned before midnight with fresh rabbit meat and what appeared to be edible roots he had gathered during his hunt. He had also brought disturbing news, communicated through urgent gestures and drawings in the dirt. He had seen signs of a large group of riders moving through the area, following a pattern that suggested they were checking on the homesteads marked on the map. The implications were clear. The gang was systematic in their operations, and when their scouts failed to report back, they would send others to investigate. Sarah and her mother had perhaps 1 or 2 days before their cabin would be visited by men far more dangerous than the pair they had already dealt with. Ayana pointed to Margaret's room, then made a gesture that seemed to ask about her condition. When Sarah indicated that her mother was still too weak to travel, the warrior nodded grimly. He understood that they would have to make their stand at the homestead, regardless of the odds against them. Over the next day, Ayana transformed the modest cabin into something approaching a fortress. He identified weak points in the structure and reinforced them with materials salvaged from outbuildings. He created hidden positions that would allow defenders to fire on attackers while remaining concealed. Most importantly, he established multiple escape routes that could be used if the situation became hopeless. Sarah watched these preparations with growing anxiety and admiration. Ayana worked with the efficiency of someone who had faced similar situations before. Every modification to their defenses served multiple purposes, and he wasted no time or materials on unnecessary improvements. He has done this before, Sarah told her mother during one of her visits to the sick room. Fighting white men, preparing for siege situations. He knows exactly how to turn a simple cabin into a place that can be defended by only 2 people. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you prepared to fight?" The question forced Sarah to confront something she had been avoiding. Until now, she had been focused on survival and helping her mother recover. But the approaching confrontation would require her to actively participate in violence. Could she shoot another human being, even in defense of her family? "I do not know," she admitted. "Papa taught me to use his rifle, but only for hunting. I have never pointed a gun at a person." "Pray you do not have to," Margaret said. "But if the choice is between your life and theirs, do not hesitate. Evil men understand only force." That night, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the window, watching Ayana as he maintained a silent vigil outside the cabin. The warrior seemed tireless, constantly alert, ready to respond to any threat that might emerge from the darkness. As dawn approached on what she suspected might be their last peaceful day, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. She approached Ayana and gestured toward herself, then toward the defensive positions he had prepared. She wanted him to teach her how to fight. For the next several hours, Ayana provided Sarah with an intensive education in combat tactics. He showed her how to move quietly through the defensive positions without exposing herself to enemy fire. He taught her how to reload her father's rifle quickly under stress. Most importantly, he helped her understand that survival often depended on thinking like a predator rather than prey. The lesson was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze. Horses. Multiple horses, moving in formation rather than wandering randomly. Ayana held up 6 fingers, then pointed toward the horizon. 6 riders, approaching from the east. Sarah felt her stomach clench with fear. This was not a casual patrol or a group of innocent travelers. Based on their disciplined approach and the direction of their travel, these were almost certainly members of the gang, come to investigate the fate of their missing scouts. Ayana gestured for Sarah to take her position while he moved to his own assigned location. As she crouched behind the reinforced window that would serve as her firing position, Sarah realized that the next few hours would determine whether she would live to see her mother recover or die defending the home her father had built with his own hands. The approaching riders showed no signs of peaceful intent. They moved with the confidence of men who expected no serious resistance from a cabin occupied by a sick woman and a teenage girl. They had no way of knowing that the dynamics of the situation had changed dramatically, or that their casual cruelty had earned them an enemy who fought by rules they did not understand. As the riders drew closer, Sarah checked her rifle one final time and tried to calm her racing heart. In a few minutes, she would discover whether the lesson she had learned about courage and survival would be sufficient to protect the people she loved most in the world. The 6 riders approached the homestead with the casual confidence of men who had done this many times before. Sarah could see them clearly now through the gaps in the wooden shutters that Ayanna had modified to serve as firing ports. They wore the dusty clothes of professional outlaws, and their weapons were well-maintained and easily accessible. These were not desperate men driven to crime by circumstances. These were predators who had chosen violence as their profession. The leader of the group was a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the cabin and its surroundings. He rode slightly ahead of the others, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Sarah had no doubt that this was the boss the dead scouts had mentioned, the man who organized the systematic targeting of isolated families. "Tom, Jim," the leader called out as the group stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. "Come on out. We need to talk." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as silence answered the man's call. Beside the cabin, hidden in a position Ayanna had prepared among some boulders, the Comanche warrior remained motionless. Sarah knew he was there only because she had watched him take his position. To the approaching outlaws, the homestead probably appeared deserted. Maybe they rode on to check the next place, one of the other men suggested. "That Spencer place is only 10 miles north." "No," the leader replied firmly. Tom knows better than to deviate from the plan without sending word. Something's wrong here. The man studied the cabin with growing suspicion. Sarah realized that his experience in this brutal business had given him instinct about when situations were not as they appeared. The lack of response from his scouts, combined with subtle signs that the homestead was occupied, had put him on alert. "Spread out," the leader ordered. "Johnson, you and Miller circle around back. Hayes and Walker take the sides. I'll approach from the front. If anybody starts shooting, remember we want the girl alive if possible." Sarah felt sick at the casual way he spoke about her fate. These men had reduced her to a commodity, something to be captured and sold like livestock. The realization filled her with a cold anger that helped steady her shaking hands on the rifle. As the outlaws began to spread out according to their leader's instructions, Ayanna made his presence known in a way that turned the entire confrontation on its head. From his concealed position, he let out a war cry that echoed across the plains like the howl of an avenging spirit. The sound had an immediate and dramatic effect on the horses. The animals, already nervous from the tension their riders were projecting, began to rear and shy away from the source of the terrifying noise. 2 of the outlaws were thrown from their mounts immediately, while the others struggled to control their panicking animals. Sarah understood that this was her moment. While the outlaws were dealing with their terrified horses, they could not effectively use their weapons or coordinate their attack. She aimed carefully at the leader, who was fighting to stay in his saddle while trying to draw his pistol. The shot from Sarah's rifle was the signal for Ayanna to begin his own assault. The Comanche warrior moved like a force of nature, using the confusion created by the stampeding horses to close distance with his enemies. His first target was one of the men who had been thrown to the ground. Before the outlaw could regain his feet, Ayanna's knife found its mark. Sarah was already reloading, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the chaos erupting around the cabin. The leader had managed to control his horse and was bringing his pistol to bear on Ayanna's position. Sarah's second shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his weapon. The remaining outlaws were beginning to recover from their initial shock and confusion. One man had managed to dismount and take cover behind a large rock, from where he began returning fire with a rifle of his own. Another was trying to work his way around to a position where he could get a clear shot at the cabin. Iana seemed to anticipate every move the outlaws made. He used the terrain around the homestead like a weapon, appearing and disappearing among the rocks, and scrub brush in ways that made him nearly impossible to target. Each time one of the outlaws thought they had him pinned down, he would emerge from a completely different position to strike again. Sarah found herself caught up in the deadly rhythm of the battle. Load, aim, fire, reload. Her father's training had prepared her for the mechanical aspects of using the rifle, but nothing could have prepared her for the psychological impact of shooting at other human beings. Each time she pulled the trigger, she forced herself to think about her mother lying helpless in the bedroom, about what these men would do to both of them if they won this fight. The wounded leader was trying to retreat to a safer position when Iana intercepted him. The confrontation between the two men was brief, but brutal. The outlaw was bigger and stronger, but Iana fought with the skill and intensity of someone defending his adopted family. When it was over, the leader lay still on the ground, and one more threat had been eliminated. Two of the outlaws broke and ran, deciding that whatever they had been promised for this job was not worth dying for. They managed to catch their scattered horses and rode hard toward the horizon, leaving behind their companions who had been less fortunate or less quick to recognize when a situation had turned hopeless. The remaining outlaw, trapped behind his rocky shelter, found himself in an impossible position. Iana had worked around to a position where he could prevent the man from retreating, while Sarah maintained covering fire from the cabin. After a few minutes of tense standoff, the trapped man threw down his weapon and shouted his surrender. Sarah kept her rifle trained on the surrendering outlaw, while Iana approached cautiously. The man was young, perhaps only a few years older than Sarah herself, and his face showed the terror of someone who had suddenly realized he was on the wrong side of a fight he could not win. "Please," the young outlaw begged. "I do not want to be part of this. They forced me to ride with them." Iana looked towards Sarah, clearly seeking her guidance on what to do with their prisoner. Sarah found herself facing a moral dilemma she had never expected to confront. This man had come to her home with the intention of robbing and possibly kidnapping her. But he was also young and frightened, claiming to be an unwilling participant in the gang's crimes. "Who sent you here?" Sarah called out from her position in the cabin. "How many others are there?" "A man named Crawford," the young outlaw replied quickly, eager to provide information that might save his life. "He has maybe 20 men working for him. We were supposed to check on Tom and Jim, see if they had found anything worth taking." "What happens to the families you rob?" The young man's face went pale. "The men get killed. The women and children get sold to traders who take them south into Mexico. It is not my idea. I just needed work." Sarah felt her anger returning. This man might be young and frightened now, but he had been willing to participate in activities that destroyed innocent families. The fact that he claimed to be motivated by desperation rather than greed did not make his crimes any less serious. Iana seemed to reach his own conclusions about the prisoner. He tied the young outlaw securely and placed him under guard while he and Sarah discussed what to do next. Through gestures and simple words, they managed to communicate the key facts of their situation. Crawford and his gang represented a threat that extended far beyond this single homestead. The map they had found on the Dead Scout showed that at least a dozen families were targeted for robbery and worse. If Sarah and Iana simply defended their own cabin and ignored the larger problem, other innocent people would suffer the same fate the McKenna family had narrowly avoided. But they were only two people, and one of them was committed to caring for a sick woman. Taking the fight to Crawford's gang would mean leaving Margaret alone and defenseless, something Sarah could not bring herself to do. The solution came from an unexpected source. During the battle, Margaret had managed to leave her bed and make her way to the main room of the cabin. She was weak and unsteady, but her fever had broken during the night, and She was more alert than she had been in weeks. "I heard everything," she told Sarah and Ayanna. "That man Crawford has to be stopped, and you two are the only ones who can do it." "Mama, you are still too sick to be left alone," Sarah protested. "I am better," Margaret replied firmly. "Not well, but better. And I would rather die here, defending my home, than live knowing that other families will suffer because we were too afraid to act." Margaret's determination reminded Sarah of her father's stubborn courage. The older woman understood the stakes involved and was prepared to accept the risks that came with doing what was right rather than what was safe. Ayanna studied Margaret with obvious respect. Though he could not understand her words, her tone and expression communicated her meaning clearly enough. She was giving them permission to leave, to take the fight to their enemies rather than simply waiting for the next attack. The captured outlaw provided additional intelligence that shaped their planning. Crawford's gang operated from an old trading post about 30 miles to the north. The location was defensible and well-supplied, but it also represented a fixed position where the outlaws could be found and confronted. More importantly, the gang was apparently planning to strike several homesteads simultaneously within the next few days. If Sarah and Ayanna could disrupt those plans, they might save lives beyond their own. As the sun set on what had been the most violent day of Sarah's life, she found herself preparing for an even more dangerous mission. She would leave her recovering mother in the care of their captured enemy, gambling that the young outlaw's fear would keep him cooperative. Then, she and Ayanna would ride north, carrying the fight to men who had terrorized the frontier for too long. The water buckets that had started this entire adventure sat by the door, ready for the next morning's journey to the spring. But Sarah suspected that when she returned from the north, she would be a very different person from the frightened girl who had made those desperate trips alone. The frontier had a way of changing people, of forcing them to discover strengths they never knew they possessed. Tonight, she would rest and prepare. Tomorrow, she would discover whether the courage that had sustained her through the defense of her home would be sufficient for the much greater challenges that lay ahead. The journey north toward Crawford's stronghold began before dawn, when the Texas sky was still painted with stars, and the air carried the promise of another scorching day. Sarah had never ridden this far from home, and every mile took her deeper into territory where her father's warnings about frontier dangers became increasingly relevant. Ayanna had selected 2 horses from those scattered during the previous day's battle, choosing animals that showed both stamina and intelligence. He had also gathered weapons and ammunition from the dead outlaws, creating a small arsenal that might prove essential in the confrontation ahead. Sarah carried her father's rifle and the captured gang leader's pistol, weapons that felt both familiar and alien in her hands. Before leaving, they had secured the homestead as well as possible. Margaret, though still weak, had insisted she could defend herself and watch their prisoner. The captured outlaw, whose name was Billy Hodgins, seemed genuinely terrified of what Crawford would do to him if he was discovered to have betrayed the gang. His fear made him a reliable source of information and a cooperative guard for Margaret. Crawford's got the old Mendez trading post fixed up like a fort, Billy had told them during their final planning session. Stone walls, good water, plenty of supplies. But he's got maybe 15 men there now, and they're not expecting trouble from the outside. What about the families they have taken? Sarah had asked, dreading the answer. There's a holding area behind the main building, Billy replied reluctantly. Crawford sells them to slavers who come through every few weeks. The next group is supposed to arrive in 3 days. The information had eliminated any possibility of delay. If Sarah and Ayanna were going to act, it had to be soon, before more innocent people were shipped south to fates worse than death. As they rode through the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah found herself studying her companion with new appreciation for the complexity of his situation. Ayanna was risking his life to help people who were not his own people, fighting enemies who had never directly threatened his own family or tribe. His motivations remained mysterious, but his commitment was absolute. The landscape they traveled through showed the scars of the ongoing drought. Creek beds that should have been flowing with water were cracked and empty. Grass was sparse and brown, providing little forage for the wildlife that depended on it. Even the hardy mesquite and scrub oak showed signs of stress, their leaves smaller and more sparse than normal. By mid-morning, they had covered nearly half the distance to Crawford's stronghold. Ayanna called for a rest stop in a cluster of rocks that provided shade and concealment while allowing them to observe the surrounding terrain. Sarah was grateful for the break. Riding hard for hours had taxed muscles she rarely used, and the constant tension of watching for threats had left her exhausted. How do we approach a fortified position defended by 15 armed men? Sarah asked, though she knew Ayanna could not understand the specific words. Instead, she drew pictures in the dust, showing the trading post as Billy had described it, and indicating her confusion about their tactical situation. Ayanna studied her drawings, then began creating his own diagrams. He showed the trading post surrounded by various approach routes, each marked with symbols that seemed to indicate different types of terrain or cover. Then, he drew figures representing themselves in positions that suggested they would not be attacking the main fortification directly. Gradually, Sarah began to understand Ayanna's plan. They were not going to assault Crawford's stronghold head-on. Instead, they would use stealth and misdirection to achieve their objectives. The goal was not to kill every outlaw in the gang, but to rescue the captives and disrupt the criminal organization's operations. As they resumed their journey, Sarah found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in just a few days. A week ago, her biggest concern had been safely obtaining water for her mother. Today, she was riding into hostile territory to confront professional criminals who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her presence. The transformation felt both natural and impossible. Part of her could not believe she was capable of such actions, while another part recognized that frontier life had been preparing her for exactly this kind of situation all her life. Her father's lessons about survival, her mother's examples of quiet courage, and the harsh realities of living in a dangerous land had all contributed to making this mission possible. By afternoon, they had reached the hills that overlooked the Mendez trading post. The old structure was exactly as Billy had described it. Adobe walls surrounded a central courtyard, with several buildings providing both living space and defensive positions for the outlaws who had taken it over. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Sarah could see men moving casually around the compound. More disturbing were the sounds that carried on the hot air. Voices calling out in fear and desperation suggested that captives were indeed being held in the compound. Sarah felt her determination harden as she realized that real people were suffering behind those adobe walls while she and Ayanna planned their rescue attempt. Ayanna spent nearly an hour studying the compound through a small spyglass he had taken from one of the dead outlaws. He sketched the layout in remarkable detail, noting guard positions, entrance points, and what appeared to be the location of a holding area where captives were kept. His military mind was already working out approaches and escape routes. When the sun began to set, Ayanna indicated it was time to move closer. They left the horses in a secure location and began a careful approach on foot, moving from cover to cover as shadows lengthened across the desert landscape. Sarah tried to match Ayanna's silent movement, though she knew she was clumsy compared to his natural stealth. The plan they had worked out was ambitious and dangerous. Sarah would create a distraction at the front of the compound, while Ayanna infiltrated from the rear to locate and free the captives. Once the prisoners were clear, they would reunite and fight their way out together. It was not a sophisticated strategy, but it had the advantage of being simple enough to execute under stress. As full darkness fell, Sarah positioned herself near the main gate of the compound. She could hear the outlaws inside talking and laughing, their voices carrying the casual confidence of men who believed they were safe from retaliation. In a few minutes, she would shatter that confidence and discover whether her courage was sufficient for the challenges ahead. The distraction Sarah had planned was both simple and effective. Using materials she had brought from home, she created several small fires around the perimeter of the compound, each designed to suggest that a large force was surrounding the trading post. The flames would be visible from inside the walls, but would not reveal how many attackers were actually present. As the fires began to blaze in the darkness, shouts of alarm erupted from inside the compound. Sarah heard men calling out orders, the sounds of weapons being grabbed, and the general confusion that came with an unexpected threat. Through gaps in the adobe walls, she could see figures running back and forth as the outlaws tried to assess the situation. "We are surrounded," someone shouted from inside the compound. "Must be 20 men out there, maybe more." Sarah smiled grimly at how effectively her simple deception was working. Fear and darkness were magnifying a handful of small fires into evidence of a major assault. The outlaws were reacting exactly as she had hoped, focusing their attention outward while Ayanna worked his way into the compound from an unexpected direction. The rescue operation that followed tested every skill Ayanna possessed as a warrior. While the outlaws were distracted by the apparent siege, he scaled the rear wall of the compound and began searching for the holding area where captives were kept. The layout was more complex than Billy had described, with multiple buildings and courtyards creating a maze of potential hiding places. Sarah maintained her part of the deception by occasionally firing shots toward the compound, always from different positions to suggest multiple attackers. She was careful not to aim directly at the buildings, since innocent captives might be caught in crossfire, but the sound of rifle fire added to the psychological pressure on the defending outlaws. Inside the compound, Ayanna had located the holding area and discovered a situation that was worse than they had anticipated. Nearly a dozen people were imprisoned in a stone building that had been converted into a makeshift jail. The captives included entire families, from elderly grandparents to children barely old enough to walk. All showed signs of poor treatment and the despair that came with understanding their likely fate. The rescue of so many people presented logistical challenges that Ayanna had not fully anticipated. These were not strong young adults who could fight their way out alongside their rescuers. These were traumatized families who would need guidance and protection every step of the way to safety. Ayanna quickly adapted his plan to the new situation. Instead of trying to lead all the captives out immediately, he focused on freeing them and providing weapons to those capable of fighting. The able-bodied men among the prisoners were given knives, and pistols taken from outlaws Ayanna had eliminated during his infiltration. The plan was now to turn the compound itself into a battleground where superior knowledge of the terrain would offset the outlaws' advantage in numbers. Sarah heard the sounds of fighting erupting inside the compound and knew that Ayanna had begun the main phase of the rescue operation. She intensified her own attacks, moving closer to the walls and targeting specific positions where outlaws were trying to organize their defense. Her rifle fire was now aimed at eliminating threats rather than simply creating confusion. The battle that raged through the trading post was unlike anything in Sarah's experience. This was not the brief, desperate fight that had taken place at her family's homestead. This was a sustained combat operation involving multiple objectives and constantly changing tactical situations. Sarah found herself drawing on reserves of courage and determination she had never known she possessed. As dawn broke over the compound, the outcome of the battle became clear. Crawford's gang had been broken. Some outlaws were dead, others had fled into the desert, and a few had surrendered when they realized their situation was hopeless. The captive families were free, though many would require medical attention, and all would need help returning to their homes or finding new places to start over. Crawford himself had been among those killed in the fighting, eliminating the leadership that had held the criminal organization together. Without his planning and authority, the remaining gang members would likely scatter and pursue individual criminal careers rather than continuing their systematic targeting of isolated families. Sarah found herself standing in the courtyard of the compound as the rescued families began to emerge into the sunlight. These people owed their lives to the desperate mission she and Ayanna had undertaken, and their gratitude was overwhelming. But Sarah felt no sense of triumph, only exhaustion and a deep desire to return home to her mother. The journey back to the McKenna homestead took 2 days, slowed by the need to escort rescued families partway toward their destinations. Several of the former captives decided to abandon their isolated homesteads and travel together toward more established settlements, where they would be safer from future criminal activity. As Sarah's cabin finally came into sight, she felt a profound sense of relief. The building looked exactly as she had left it, and smoke rising from the chimney suggested that her mother was well enough to maintain a fire. The water buckets still sat beside the door, waiting for the next trip to the spring. Margaret McKenna was indeed much improved when Sarah entered the cabin. The fever had broken completely, and color had returned to her cheeks. She embraced her daughter with strength that had been absent for weeks, and Sarah realized that the worst of the crisis had passed. "Tell me everything," Margaret said as they sat together in the main room where so much violence had recently taken place. Sarah related the events of the past few days, from the approach to Crawford's stronghold to the final battle that had freed the captives. As she spoke, she realized how extraordinary her recent experiences had been and how much she had changed during the course of the adventure. "And Ayanna?" Margaret asked. "Where is he now?" Sarah looked toward the window, where she could see the Comanche warrior standing near the corral, apparently preparing to leave. Throughout the journey home, he had maintained his protective vigilance, but something in his demeanor suggested that his self-appointed mission was coming to an end. "I think he believes his obligation is fulfilled," Sarah replied. "We are safe, the immediate threat is eliminated, and you are recovering. He has done what he set out to do." Sarah walked outside to say goodbye to the man who had saved her family and helped her discover strength she never knew she possessed. Ayanna was indeed preparing to leave, his few possessions gathered and his horse ready for travel. The farewell was conducted mostly in silence, since they still shared no common language beyond gestures and expressions. But when Ayanna clasped Sarah's shoulder in a gesture of respect and friendship, she understood that their brief alliance had created a bond that would last for the rest of her life. As Sarah watched Ayanna ride away toward the horizon, she realized that her solitary journeys to the spring would now have a very different character. She was no longer the frightened girl who had made those trips in terror of what might be waiting in the wilderness. She was a young woman who had faced the worst that the frontier could offer and had emerged victorious. The water buckets beside the cabin door represented more than just a tool for survival now. They were a symbol of the determination and courage that ordinary people could summon when protecting those they loved. Sarah picked up the buckets and headed toward the spring, no longer afraid of what she might encounter along the way. The Texas sun beat down on her shoulders as always had, but Sarah McKenna walked with the confidence of someone who had discovered that even in the most hostile wilderness, unexpected allies could appear and extraordinary courage could emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. Her mother would recover, their homestead would endure, and the memory of a quiet Comanche warrior would remind her always that help sometimes came from the most unlikely sources.